Thank you, John and David. So I understand you have a presentation. You'll be able to respond to some of the points raised from the deputations as well.
Sure. Yep.
Great, thank you.
That's fine. Right. So my name's David Faulkner. I'm one of the team leaders of the city planning area. And
John Higgins, the Head of Resource Consents.
So we're here today to give a presentation that we're giving to community boards at the moment, and also a part of that is we'll respond to some of the points that have been made in the deputations. This is obviously quite a hot topic at the moment, and so we're here to try and explain what the situation is, and as I said, we're already rolling this out with the community boards. We went to Spraydon Cashmere on Monday, we've got Papua New Guinea tomorrow, and the other city community boards later this month. I just want to start by saying, so John and I are council staff. We are, in most cases, not the decision makers in this, and as has been pointed out already, a lot of this is coming from direction from central government, which we are legally required to give effect to. So we'll try and explain the situation and where the ability is for us to influence that, but in a lot of cases it is more about passing on the message in terms of what the direction is and what's happening at the moment. So just first of all, I just wanted to explain what intensification is. Really, intensification is about having more houses within the same footprint of the city. And as has been pointed out, so we have somewhere for our growing population to live without losing our productive land. So the two main ways for the cities to grow is generally up and out. So out is more of the urban expansion, urban sprawl, greenfield development, that kind of thing. And up is sort of intensification. It doesn't need to necessarily be up, it doesn't need to necessarily be higher. It could be houses in backyards, sort of infilling development. It could be sort of brownfield development, which is converting places like industrial land to residential. So there is a whole range of means that intensification can be used. And I just wanted to sort of paint a bit of a picture of some of the challenges and opportunities and the reason why this is an issue at the moment. So our city is growing quite a lot at the moment, has been over the last few years. And as was pointed out by the deputation, there is a lot of building happening at the moment. The city is changing and will continue to do so over the number of coming decades. We're residents of the city and we see the change and we understand the concerns that are going on at the moment. Whilst growth is inevitable, it needs to be well planned. That's what we're trying to do. And it will require us to do it differently, especially with this direction from central government, which is quite directive. We're used to change in the city post-earthquake, so we can learn from our experience of how we can adapt to these changes. And we are largely, as has been pointed out in the deputation, we are largely already ahead of the game. We are seeing a lot of building. We've had a lot of building happening. We are comparatively affordable compared to other cities. That's largely because we have been ahead. We've been building, and that is a real asset for the city. But there is a lot of work to be done in the future. And yeah, as I say, we're citizens of the city. We're in this together. We need to make this work best for our future and for our children and grandchildren. So what's happening at the moment? So this is a map of the city showing where intensification can happen as a right. So the more darker areas, especially in the central city, and then the sort of dark orange areas around the central city are where there's medium density, the medium density zoning. And then the lighter orange areas is our transition zone, where we have some density, and then the lighter areas is our residential suburban zone. So the closer you get to the city, the more density is allowed, and around some of our key activity centres, some of our shopping centres as well. And largely that is where we're getting intensification. So most of it is happening in the central city or in the inner suburbs. So this is showing the red areas is where the most intensification is happening over the last few years. We do manage intensification at the moment through a number of rules in our district plan. These are just some of the key things we control through the district plan in terms of height, tree planting, the maximum density in some areas, the maximum coverage, so we allow that there's still space for green space on a site and vegetation, the amount of outdoor living space that every unit should have, setbacks, urban design assessments, that kind of thing. So, and I've got a diagram there of the recession planes just to show that we also control shading onto neighbouring properties as well. But so these rules, as been alluded to, did come from our district plan review, which did go through full public consultation in between 2013 and sort of 2015, and then hearings. But decisions were made by independent hearings panel, as was alluded to before, chaired by Sir John Hanson. Appeals were only on points of law, so it wasn't a decision that council made. It was a decision that an independent hearings panel made. And the panel was also given a statement of expectations. This was directed by central government through an order in council, that the district plan review must do these things, which is significantly reduce the reliance on resource consents, reduce the number of controls and standards to encourage innovation and choice, and reduce the number of the requirements for notification, and also facilitate an increase of housing supply. So that gives you a bit of a background of how the rules ended up the way they were. It was very much trying to enable development, and there was obviously not put too many hurdles in the way in terms of notification. So I just wanted to sort of clarify why we needed intensification. Some of that was some questions about asked that this morning. So yeah, as I mentioned before, Christchurch has got comparatively affordable housing. There is obviously housing need for some members of our community, so it's not affordable for all by any means. But compared to other cities, we have got generally lower house prices, and there's a correlation that we have built far more houses per person than the other major cities in the country. As has been mentioned before, more intensification provides for more housing supply. It helps us. We've still got a housing issue in terms of there's almost 2,000 people on our housing waiting list for social housing at the moment. It helps with less sprawl, less emissions from people having to drive further to get to employment in the more central areas. Protection of productive land, and helps with regeneration of our city. There was also a question about the impact on the central city, and that is a very live concern. I absolutely agree. But this is a graph showing the amount of houses that we need over the next 30 years to provide for just for the needs of the growing population according to projections. You'll see down the bottom is, and the light green, is the 20,000 houses on top of, well, the houses that we need to get 20,000 people in the central city, which is just a small amount of the total number of houses we need. So whilst, yes, we definitely need housing in the central city, and we're looking to do that, we will still need housing in suburban areas and housing in greenfield areas to meet our population needs. So, and it's really the suburban areas where the majority of that growth will come. Even when the central city is fully built, we need a lot more housing in the suburban areas. And we are getting a lot more intensification at the moment. It is growing, but so that graph shows over the last few years the amount of houses for intensification that we've seen. But our target in order to meet population growth is even higher, and that's just to keep up with the needs of a growing population. And so we still will need more growth just to meet the needs. I'll now pass over to John to talk about the consenting process.
Okay, so most multi-unit developments need a resource consent. There's a trigger when they're, depending on the zoning, when there's 3 or 4 units, but everything over that needs a resource consent. When it comes in, they make an application. Council staff are required to do 2 assessments. One, whether it should be notified, and that's whether it should consult with neighbours or the general public at large, and whether or not the consent should be granted. There's been a big push over about a decade or even longer to streamline and simplify the Resource Management Act, and that's resulted in less applications being notified. I recall when I first started in this sort of business, there was a lot more applications that were notified. Now it's very few, less than 1% of overall applications. As David's already noted, the district plan even reinforced that too, and there was objectives in the district plan review that to reduce reliance on resource consents and notification. So the result of all that is there's not many applications that are notified now. I'm just a bit more of an explanation about what triggers notification. It's where there are minor effects, we look at neighbours, and where there's more than minor effects, we're looking at public notification. It's really important to note, because obviously neighbours see this monstrosity sort of happening next door. We have to take into account when we're doing our assessments what is permitted by the district plan, what's anticipated by the district plan. It's not a sort of clean slate. It is, we have to acknowledge that bulk, that scale that is anticipated by the zoning. Most of the time what we see are small breaches. We don't often see significant breaches. So I'm talking about, you know, say a recession plan intrusion. It might only be 50 mils, it might be 100 mils. It triggers the provision, but it's a very small breach that possibly no one would really even know existed if they didn't see it on a plan. The other thing with the district plan is we have a lot of rules that say we cannot notify to neighbours. So it's got a specific clause there that says you cannot notify this particular rule breach to neighbours. So that's pretty common throughout our plan. And then when it comes to consider whether to grant or decline an application, we're looking at the objectives and policies of the plan, and we're looking at the level of adverse effects. And similar to the notification decision, it's not a clean slate assessment. We're looking at what's anticipated, what's permitted by the plan, in terms of we're looking at over and above that. And this was mentioned earlier in the deputations. It was discussed. So urban design assessments, and I mentioned before, if you're over 3 or over 4 units, you require an urban design assessment. Now, the applicant usually submits one of them, so they get an urban designer, they submit it with the application, we review that assessment. The key point here is that, and I note it here, that assessments are primarily focused on arrangement, appearance and function rather than design preference. So a lot of the time the urban design assessment is around the edges. It's not a complete assessment of the whole application, and we can look at everything. It's really that that size and scale, that bulk and location is set by the bulk and location standards, and the urban design assessments are sort of a layer on top of that. And I'll just note that in that last bullet point. Now, this is something that comes up regularly, that there's an upper density limit in the intensification zones. And I just note there that there's no specific density control. When you actually get to the provisions, it says there is no density control. That is controlled by the bulk and location provisions and the urban design assessment to some extent. There are references made in a policy or two about at least 50 household per hectare, but it doesn't specify an upper limit. It's just an at least. And then another issue that's commonly raised with us is this enhanced development mechanism rule, and that is an optional rule that very few developments pick up on. They can choose to do a development under that rule, or they can choose to do it under the normal bulk and location standard zone rules. And I've put a copy of a relevant decision from Tony Hughes Johnson QC, who sort of traverses this whole upper density limits and the EDM rule in some detail, and it's a very useful decision if you want to get your head around how it all works. It's comprehensive, it's lengthy, and it's a little bit technical at times, but it's a good decision nonetheless. That is on our website, so people will be able to go and read that. Common concerns raised with us. Now, we have unprecedented levels of multi-units at the moment. They're coming in thick and fast, and they're not slowing. I think last week was the highest ever that we had, so number of applications. So they're still coming in pretty regularly at the moment. So I just note some of the concerns that are being raised with us there about construction effects, the dominance of these buildings, how they impact on local, the character of local areas, the lack of parking. You get a number of these in one street, and there's a much more demand for on-street car parking. You're transitioning from a site with one house with lots of landscaping and trees to maybe 4 to 6 units which have very few trees. And then there's some concerns about the quality of these developments and the lack of consultation with neighbours. And a new emerging one is often neighbours are being asked to contribute towards new boundary fences. So the other sort of concerns that are raised, and we respond regularly, we're getting multiple inquiries per day around some of the stuff, so we're responding, we're sending copies of applications, and we're working through these issues with people that sort of contact us. And then my second to last slide, but just some concerns around are the decisions being made correctly, and we've tried to sort of really enhance how we make decisions on these to make sure we are doing them as they should be done. And we've got a core group of senior planners who either oversee these applications or they're considering the decisions on them. We're also working through a practice note, and most of them go out to commissioners, and we use a range of commissioners. So there's a lot of different people making decisions, and these are qualified and experienced people, so it's being shared around in terms of different people and the experience. We've also just completed a recent audit of decision making. That's yet to come back to council. It's planned to, but that's not raising any particular issues. But I'll go over that in some more detail once we can get it back to council. And then just some, this is a bit of a double up, but some more improvements underway, talking about we've concentrated on people, so we've just got a specialist sort of pool of people, and then the practice note. And the thing we haven't mentioned so far is and councillors would have seen this before, but there's an urban design review of medium and high density housing, and that's to inform further work in this area. And it's sort of been held up, that piece of work, as it sort of gets incorporated into the NPS and RMA reform stuff that's coming through. So that's it from me, so back over to David.
Okay, so since it was raised this morning, and it's quite a hot topic, I just wanted to cover off some of the government direction that's coming, because it will have significant implications on us. So, slides have disappeared. Sure, thank you. So yeah, the first one is the National Policy Statement on Urban Development. That was gazetted by government last year. Now this is one of the highest order documents under the Resource Management Act. We must do effect to it under legislation. It was set by the government, and the aims of the government were really to ensure that towns and cities are well functioning and meet the changing needs of their communities. It was really in response to the concerns that there's not enough housing being built and wanting to enable more development, and especially it was very directive about having development in the right place, close to transport routes, close to employment, close to the sort of services and amenities that mean that people don't have to travel too far. Now, we did put a submission on this, and I think it's fair to say that Council shares a lot of the concerns that have been raised this morning from the deputations, and if you read that submission, we've got a link there, you'll see that we did put a lot of, we raised a lot of concerns with central government on this when it was consulted on in 2019. But despite that, it was gazetted last year. We now must give effect to it. So what's the main parts of the National Policy Statement? There's a requirement to do a future development strategy to provide for at least 30 years of growth, and we did of the release report over the weekend, which showed we've got enough capacity at the moment for 30 years of growth in the city. And that was a point well made before. And we must also do a sort of spatial planning exercise to look at the future needs. But we will have to repeatedly ensure that we have 30 years of growth. And as the city is growing, that means we'll have to keep looking and ensuring that we've got 30 years of growth, and may need to find more growth areas to provide for that. The next thing is the NPS requires the removal of minimum parking requirements by February next year, and that must be done without public consultation. That is what the National Policy Statement says. We cannot consult the public on it. That's not our choice, that's what we're required to do. So we are working through that and have to do that by February, and we are aware of the concerns that will around that, but we cannot consult the public on it. But what we can consult the public on is by August next year, we are required to undertake a plan change to look at intensification. That was some of the aspects that were raised this morning around potential increases in building heights and densities. And that will be through full public consultation, with everyone able to make submissions and be heard on that. So that will not go through without public participation. So just to explain the directions that come out in terms of that intensification. The NPS requires it in the central city zones, and it doesn't define exactly where the central city zones are. We're looking at that at the moment. But potentially there will be unlimited height, which is a bit of a change since post-earthquake. We had a height limit in the central city, but now the national direction is to have potentially unlimited height in the central city, and enable 6 stories of development within a walkable catchment of the central city. Exactly what a walkable catchment is, still working through with central government what they mean by that. It also says enable, so it doesn't mean every development must be 6 stories, it just means that we can't prevent a development if it wants to be 6 stories high. Then in metropolitan centres, which is a term we don't use, it's an Auckland term, must enable at least 6 stories as well, and within a walkable catchment of those areas. Once again, we're trying to work out what does that mean for Christchurch. As I say, we don't have that term at the moment, so does that apply for Christchurch or not? Once again, we're working our way through that and getting guidance from central government. Then the next one is around rapid transit stops, which is once again we don't have in Christchurch at this stage. That's light rail or busways. We are, as you know, doing a business case on that, but that would also enable 6 stories within walkable catchments of those stops. And just to reassure, there was a map that was put up in the slide by one of the deputations, which is absolutely accurate in terms of our submission, showing density along core public transport routes. Following our submission, and hopefully it was our submission influenced this, the government did change the criteria. So that is no longer a criteria, so I can assure the people making the deputation that that map is no longer valid. They are now focusing on rapid transit, which is just light rail and busways and the like, rather than every single core public transport route in the city. So you can rest assured that that has changed from central government. And then in all other locations, they want to enable density within a level of accessibility or demand. So there was also questions about, can we say no to tall buildings? And there was this term qualifying matters, and yes, that is in the National Policy Statement, where we can modify the direction from government. These are some of the matters where we can automatically do that around public open space. So we're hoping that, and we're working through that because it's where the Rickon and Bush can be one of those areas. National significant infrastructure, hazards, so we can take into account hazards, heritage, landscapes, vegetation. So we're hoping that that will enable some areas to be protected. And then it says any other matter that makes high density inappropriate. So we are looking at what those matters could be. But there is quite a high bar to get to meet that test. There must be site-specific analysis, so analysis of every single property, whether its high density is appropriate or not. And we must ensure that the costs and the broader impacts of those limits are assessed, and that the costs don't outweigh the benefits of those. There's also a question raised about amenity, and that is very much was in the panel's mind when they made the decision on the Rickon area that was mentioned before. but the NPSUD has sort of changed the ball game to some extent. They now have this policy that amenity values of themselves are not an adverse effect. So that does change the situation. Whether that means that will change it for that particular area or any other area in the city, we don't know yet. We're looking at this, and once again, it will be something that, whilst council can make a decision on this, it's likely that there'll be other forums, potentially the Environment Court, where the final decision may be made through on these matters. I also want to briefly touch on the resource management reforms that came out recently, and submissions closed yesterday, and we submitted on this last week. These are the new acts, as you're aware, that will replace the RMA. There is requirements in there about that we have sufficient housing. Once again, amenity values is no longer a matter, according to the government, that to have particular regard to. There's matters around protecting voice soils, reducing greenhouse emissions, potentially having less public notification, and having regional plans rather than district plans. So once again, and Christchurch City Council will only have one vote on those on the committee that will approve that plan. So those are some of the changes that are coming. And these are the timeframes Parliament wants to, well, the government wants it through Parliament by next year. And just briefly, there has been some questions raised. I just want to briefly touch on car parking as a concern, and there is I know a draft Central City parking policy coming to council next week that will look at parking and how we can manage it in the light of the fact that these minimums are being removed. One of the policies is about enabling residential parking and prioritising that. So we are looking at ways that we can deal with these issues. We do take infrastructure and hazard into account when we're looking at zoning. Also, we look at green space, and we're looking at where we can do some neighbourhood planning around these areas to better provide for green space to offset obviously the potential amenity being lost by the development. As John alluded to, we do take design into account, and we're looking at improvements to how we assess design. As mentioned before, we are doing a business case on mass rapid transit and commuter rail to look at where we can, well, if it's an option to have density along those corridors, if we have those corridors in the future. And we are looking at how we can manage greenfield development and highly productive land as well. John's alluded to the maximum density at the moment, which is not in the plan, and there will be limits to whether we can put a maximum density in the future, with the national policy statement being so directive. And there's been questions about having non-residential activities taking up space in residential areas, and that's why we have to intensify, or that we're already got enough capacity, so we shouldn't have to intensify. The national policy statement requires us to implement these directions regardless of whether we have enough capacity or not, or whether that capacity has been taken up by other activities. We still have to give effect to the national policy statement. That is the direction. And one of the concerns that's been raised is around the use of short-term accommodation for housing, whether that's taking away from residential capacity. We are doing a plan change to manage that better, and that's going through the process at the moment. But once again, regardless of how much capacity is taken up by short-term accommodation, we still need to provide for intensification under the national policy statement. I just wanted to close by showing you this picture, and I don't know if you recognise this picture or not, but a lot of concern, and rightfully so, is that this is a direction that is looking at an urban form that is foreign to Christchurch. This is actually a picture of Carlton Mill Road in Maryvale, an area that used to have single housing many years ago and now has sort of six-storey development. Obviously the context is slightly different. It's not next to Haley Park, it's close to Central City, but it does show that there are areas that have transitioned to higher density and are working reasonably all right. This may be part of our future with these directions that we're having to give effect to. So that's the end of the presentation. Happy to take questions.
Thank you very much. Got the Mayor then, Pauline.
Thank you very much for the presentation. I think it's really helpful to get, factual information out into the public arena, and asking the questions that I'm going to ask. I'm not opposing intensification. I've been really clear about over-intensification and the impact on amenity. So, and I want to start with amenity because I just wondered, one thing that I thought was missing from here, and I kind of apologise for not raising it earlier so that you could have had a couple more slides, but can someone speak about the urban design assessment? Because when I've heard staff tell us about the urban design assessment, it's an incredibly positive process for developers, and the outcomes are better for them and for the people that buy their houses. So is there someone here that could actually speak to it? I've heard, maybe we could get someone to come down by the end of the presentation section. My other questions was, has any development proceeded under the enhanced development mechanism or comprehensive development mechanism, whatever it's called?
There may have been one or two early on.
No, that were granted under it.
I think, yeah, maybe early on.
Oh, I thought there were none.
Well, because it was a transitional provision that came through from the LERP.
Yes, I know what it was.
And then obviously the new district plan came over the top of that.
Yeah.
But if there is...
I thought a couple had been applied for, but that none had actually been approved under it. But
there certainly hasn't
you're
been
saying
in recent times.
It's one or two, and ever since the residential medium density provisions went in, there've been none.
Correct.
Yeah, and that was because the enhanced development, whatever it was, comprehensive development, had a maximum, whereas the
Density.
medium density doesn't, right?
It's more restrictive, so they don't use those provisions.
Who signs off on qualifying matters, and can it be challenged, and if so, who and how?
Yeah, so the responsibility for notifying plan change will sit with council with around this table, and as part of that, we'll consider whether there's any qualifying matters to obviously amend the heights, and then they'll go through a hearings process and a decision will be made, and we anticipate that will come back to council. The uncertainty is obviously the new legislation under the Natural and Built Environment Act is going to go through Parliament at a similar time, and that sets up a different regime for in terms of interest in regional planning committee. And we haven't seen the detail of the transition provision, so we don't know exactly what the timing will be in terms of whether council will still have the functions of approving plan changes at that stage or not.
But we have to introduce the draft plan by October.
By August next year.
August next year, right.
Yep, and then there could be yet appeals to the Environment Court. So,
Yeah.
as I mentioned before, the final decision may end up in the Environment Court, who knows?
Yeah,
Yep.
so
Yep.
I just kind of, because I didn't want anyone to think that we decide that it's a qualifying matter and then nobody can challenge that.
No.
Okay.
Okay.
Does the MPSUD get absorbed into the Natural and Built Environments Act?
Yeah, so the Natural and Built Environment Act talks about setting up a national planning framework, which they say will incorporate all the national policy statements. So there's a number of national policy statements, including this one, that they'll incorporate that all together into this framework. From what we've heard, they are not anticipating changing the direction significantly through that framework, but that's a decision for government, obviously.
So it's likely that that will also contain provisions around qualifying matters?
Yes, that's
right.
Yep.
And yeah, they were my questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Pauline?
Oh, thank you. Can we just go to slide number 2? Because my area that I represent in St Albans is seeing an incredible eye-watering amount of intensification, and the feedback from the residents there is that they're not opposed to intensification, it's the over-intensification. So, see, that doesn't look too bad, but we are not seeing that. We are seeing the buildings right up against the street, right up against the boundary, 0 trees. That's even got some car parking in the back there. So it's like, yes, you outline all the rules and that, but it's interpretation of that, an interpretation of amenity. So how can we overcome that barrier of what these words mean to a community? That's the problem here, isn't it?
Yes, so you're right. This development is quite different than most of the typical ones we seem to see, which is one narrow site with 6 units put on it. So it's quite a different outcome. So that was one of the things that we were looking through this urban design study, and then it sort of got caught up with the NPS and the RMA reform. So we're having to consider any changes in that context now, but yeah, you can definitely on a larger site do quite a different development.
Yeah, and I think that's the point I raised in a briefing the other day, that when developers are trying to maximise the build on where there was once one house, one site, it's a very different matter than if you actually maybe get 3 or 4 sites. You can do much better design and have a better outcome. So I just wonder if we should encapsulate that.
So it's a good point, and we tend to see mostly the one sites because it's simple for developers. They can buy one site, they can develop it, they get in and out of there, and it's easy.
But it's giving us poor outcomes.
Yeah, and to come back to the Mayor's question before about urban design, it is quite, so what we see normally is there's several iterations through the application process largely in relation to urban design matters. So we're trying to really improve the outcomes that we're getting at the start of the process, and we make some good improvements. But my point in my presentation is there's limitations to that. It's only so far we can go with the urban design assessment, and hopefully we can get someone to talk about that sort of detail down soon. But there are limitations. We can't take it from the single site and get something like this.
No, that's right. And the other thing is too that when you talked about common concerns, and one of them's green spaces, but trees is what we're hearing big time, the loss of trees. Yep. So I think that should be incorporated into that. And just quickly, I've had a member of the community talk to me about, the construction period is quite stressful sometimes on neighbours, and if you've got a crew that is not very sensitive to neighbours, it can be very abrasive and cause a lot of stress. Someone came to me the other day and said that Melbourne has a kind of a warrant of fitness type thing that builders should comply with during construction. Have you heard of that? And could we look at maybe bringing something like that in, where they sign up to just small things like be careful where you park, don't have the radio on too loud, no really bad language, really loud, stuff like that people find, and rubbish is a big concern as well.
So I don't know about that standard. We often don't have any discretion over it because most of these developments are restricted discretion, which to the non-compliance and construction is not usually one. So they still have to comply with the construction noise standard. That's reasonably flexible and generous, but we do address complaints.
That's reactive, isn't it? So is there a mechanism that we can perhaps be a bit more proactive?
Well, we can try, but in terms of we don't have discretion over it, so we can't put a whole lot of conditions saying you must do X, Y, and Z. We can only monitor it in terms of the construction noise standard. And we do, and we attend noise complaints, we attend issues like another common issue you get is the construction vehicles are parked all over the street and footpath. So we do what we can, but again there's limitations about what we can do.
Thanks.
Yanni?
Just, the irony in this, and that there's all this focus on finding new places to plant trees, and yet all the stuff that we've heard, there's hardly any protection for trees. What sort of strength can we put on the protection of established mature trees in terms of the climate change emergency that we're in, and all the signals that we've had from central government about the importance of trees?
So we'd have to introduce new rules for better existing tree protection.
Right.
And also requirements when you're doing new developments for more landscape and tree plantings. They're not there. And I think something that David alluded to before was, and I think you've actually championed this a wee bit too, about how we could create more green space in these areas. So this is happening on private land, but how can we offset some of this intensification with public works, such as small parks, more landscaping and roads as well.
But surely, yeah, I mean, I think we need to do that. But just in terms of the MPS, like how strict can we be around protecting trees as part of this process? Does it offer us any ability to say that, you know, established trees are really important in terms of climate change, and therefore can we use that as a qualifying matter?
Well, I don't know the answer. Maybe David can expand on it, but I know Auckland used to have quite wide-reaching tree protection provisions in their district plan, and they got removed by the government because it was seen as a barrier to development.
Yep.
It was restricting development of sites, so they removed that ability to have blanket protection. So now we're down to only being able to protect quite special trees, you know, mature trees that have got some special values associated with them. Okay. So that's where we're at this time.
Yeah, that was going to say, so it was about 10 years ago, I think, the government at the time changed the RMA again. There's been lots of changes to the RMA over the last 30 years. One of them was to remove that blanket tree protection that you're mentioning. It was in response to some of the people in Auckland, but it applied nationwide. So we can't protect trees generally. We can protect individual trees, but they must be assessed to make sure that they are, by an arborist, to make sure they are a special tree. So we've only got a limited number of trees.
Sorry, just to be a little bit more clearer. So, like for example, where we've got neighbourhoods that have very little tree canopy coverage, or have lower than other areas, or don't meet certain measures, are we able to use that as a qualifying matter to say that we don't want intensification in those areas because of the impact on the existing tree canopy that's there, given with all the climate change and environmental sustainability issues that the government, the council, people are generally now aware of, compared to, say, 10 years ago when it was a very different situation?
So if they are a protected tree, a scheduled tree, yes, we can. As I said, that's quite a limited number of trees. What we are looking at is whether we can encourage the planting of more trees. So we already require a certain percentage of the site to be planted, and we're looking at whether we can change those as well. And we are also looking at the impact that will have on development, because that's something we've got to consider on the urban development MPS, the capacity that may take out. But we are, it's a balancing act.
I just flag it as an area that I think we've seen the concerns that have been raised. We certainly have seen the experience of the loss of lots of mature trees in some areas. Just the other thing, you referred to the housing capacity assessment. So I'm just trying to get this right. So we've actually got enough capacity, so we don't actually need more capacity. And I mean, in that document, it talks about developers prefer single and two-storey dwellings. That residential buyers look for in a property a house design, lifestyle factors near beach or park, streetscape, neighbourhood character, school zoning, section size, landscaping, internal garage and other off-road parking, privacy, orientation to the sun, ease of heating, and freehold title appeal. So everything that people want, it seems this is doing the complete opposite. So, I mean, how much weight can we put into this capacity study to inform our either qualifying areas or our response to central government? Because it seems completely contrary to getting good neighbourhoods when we've done this research and we've got sufficient capacity and we want good urban design.
Yeah, so as I mentioned before, that we do have enough capacity, but one point I make is almost as soon as that report is written, it's out of date because there's more houses being built all the time. So we've got to continue to make sure we've got enough capacity. But also the MPS requires us to make these changes regardless of whether we have enough capacity or not. And whilst I'm sure in hearings it'll be a point of contention when there's some things that whether it should be in or out, there'll be arguments about whether we've got enough capacity or not, and that may sway the decision maker. But generally the direction is, regardless of whether you've got enough capacity, you must intensify in those areas that I outlined in that table before. That's the direction from central government.
And just the final question from me is around the height. Like, so, I mean, my understanding is it's a lot more costly to build up to 6 stories, so that's why we're seeing a lot more sort of 2 to 3 stories, you know, that the economics of building higher doesn't make a lot of sense. So a bit like the, you know, submission we heard from the residents group around trying to support it in the inner city or the CBD, but concerned about, you know, Rickett and Bush. So is there any sort of, I mean, there's no ability for us to address the height thing, is there?
Not in terms of feasibility, but we are looking at feasibility, and we are also, I suppose, something to be reminded, yes, we might enable this. It doesn't mean it will happen. We've actually, for the last 30 years, enabled about 6 stories worth of development in New Brighton. We've never had a development 6 stories in New Brighton. We enable it in the central city, and there's a number of areas in the central city where people have not built up to that height. So just because we enable it doesn't mean it's going to happen overnight. So feasibility concerns may mean that it may not be constructed. So yeah.
Thanks. Jimmy.
Thank you. My question followed Yanni, the last question. And if we review your one of slides, you know, if a Rickton bush in a house is can be considered to limit the height, because here nature has a historical heritage or all those outstanding nature features. I think the Rickton bush in a house, you know, all totally comply with this kind of criteria. But my question is, how about the boundary? How many meters? Because from the key activity center, the Rickton Mall, and also away from the Rickton house and the bush is very close. So I just want to know, particularly today, Helen and Kilmarnock Resident Association Rickton Bush, they concern probably not only Rickton Bush, maybe surrounding areas. So I just want to know how many meters, you know, extension all those Rickton Bush area can be the considered limit height.
Once again, the NPS is quite specific that the protection of public open space, as I mentioned before, is limited to the area of public open space. So not the wider catchment, the wider surrounding area. We are looking into whether there are any effects from development on the wider area that will have implications on that public open space, and some were alluded to this morning. So we are very alive to that issue, but the NPS is very restrictive that it's about the public open space itself rather than the surrounding area.
Okay, thank you.
Mel.
I had 2 questions. With the NPS intensification directions, we focus a lot on the 6-storey areas around the rapid transport, but not really that bottom one. And actually that is probably a worry because that's everywhere else. So what does it really mean when it says a height commensurate to level of accessibility? Like, does it mean if you live in a quarter-acre section close to a school somewhere, anywhere in the city, that could be 4 stories because people will want to go to this school that will become huge? Like, what is that going to mean?
That's a really good question. That last one, yes, it could be very wide-reaching. It says in any other location, but it's not as directive as the other ones in terms of saying it must be 6 stories. We're trying to work out exactly what that means. I know actually, as we speak now, the Auckland Planning Committee is having this very debate. And Auckland have great with this and all the other major cities. So yes, we will bring information to you once we've worked out, and we're working with our colleagues across the country and with central government to try and work out exactly what they meant by that last one, which is very wide ranging. Yes.
And then the other one was around the qualifying matters again. Like I imagine, Dean's Bush will be a qualifying matter, but what will that mean around the amount of area? Like, there's the bush, but will you not be able to build a high density up to 10 metres away, 100 metres? Like, what is that? What will that actually do once something's been qualified?
Yeah, as I said, it's very much about a site-by-site analysis. It's about protecting the site rather than the surrounding area. Yes, there will be, mentioned before, in the current plan we've got recession planes to prevent shading and setbacks from boundaries, so we're hoping that we'll be able to retain those as well. We're working through that at the moment, but the MPS is very specific about this, protecting the site rather than the wider neighbourhood.
So it won't really actually do that much, having these qualifying matters, because it's unlikely someone's going to go and knock over the bush. Yeah, let's hope.
Let's hope not.
Andrew.
Thank you. 2 questions, if I can. Influence and accountability. If Christchurch ends up with 1 seat at the table on a regional planning committee, should residents be concerned that there's very limited opportunity for their voice to be heard, or even their representative's voice to be heard?
Yeah, well, we'll see how it plays out. We have raised that concern in our submission on the Natural and Built Environment Act, so that is a concern we've raised.
So it's a concern.
Yeah.
All right. Now, second question really follows on from Melanie's questions. The definition of a walkable catchment, the definition of a metropolitan centre, which, as you say, we don't really have in Christchurch, or we don't define in Christchurch, and the definition of a rapid transit corridor, which, again, at the moment, we don't really have in Christchurch. There's a sense that this policy statement really is, designed, set up for Auckland and its issues and its definitions and so on. The danger is that different councils end up defining these different terms in different contexts in different cities, that then leads to legal challenge. You talk about working with colleagues around the country, but how easy is that when every city is quite different in its nature and its challenges and its needs?
Yes, it is different. It is a challenge. I do also want to point out there is guidance that the Ministry for the Environment have put out on their website around this, and some of it's quite lengthy. And it's open to the public, welcome to read what factors will be taken into account when you're trying to determine what a walkable catchment is, a rapid transit route, and a metropolitan centre, and that kind of thing. So that's the same information that we have. We don't have any extra information. We're working through that as well, and so we invite the public to look at that guidance if you want to know more, and see how that guidance can help determine how it will apply to Christchurch. Yes, there is a need to have some consistency, but you're right, there is also a need to ensure that the local context is taken into account. So, it is a balancing act.
So do you think we can get to a point where we define those terms in a way that works for Christchurch without being subject to legal challenge because our definitions are different than other parts of the country?
It's going to be a challenge. Yeah.
All right,
No
thank
worries
you.
about it. Yeah.
All right, thank you. Just one thing, because obviously we still need to actually have a defined definition around what walkable distance is in metropolitan centre. But obviously the map that we were shown earlier, which was from us, is out of date. So it might be good with the information we do have to maybe put more of an updated map of where we see the current effect being.
Yeah, so we'll definitely be doing that. We don't have a map at the moment because we're still trying to work out what it means, but definitely for the public consultation, that'll all be made public and people will be able to submit and then provide feedback on it. So absolutely.
So I'm happy to move the rest of this. You're unable to second it. Does anyone want to debate receiving this information and presentation?
You raised before around the intensification map. Don't have a key, but yeah, it would be good to get a time frame across what time that is as well. Do you know what date that the one with the red spots is?
Sorry, this one here.
Yeah.
It's
happening now, really.
yeah, it's about over the last 5 years. I think it is potentially a few months old, yeah, or if not a year old, but yeah, it's the last 3 or 4 years at least.
Right. Okay. All those in favour? Aye. Opposed? Carried. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.